America saw the perfect Kennedy marriage: the environmental crusader, his beautiful architect wife, 4 children, and a showcase green home she designed in Bedford, New York. Mary Richardson Kennedy died alone in the barn behind that house on May 16th, 2012, mid-divorce, her credit cards cut off. Days later, a 60-page affidavit written by her husband appeared in Newsweek, and her own family called it character assassination from the grave. Weeks after her Kennedy funeral, her body was quietly dug up and moved 700 feet. Her siblings say nobody told them. It all began with a wedding on a boat. April 15th, 1994. A research vessel on the Hudson River, the same river Robert F. Kennedy Jr. had built his environmental reputation defending. The ceremony was small. There was no cathedral, no crowd of senators, no motorcade of cousins spilling out of Hyannisport. Mary Richardson was 6 months pregnant. The groom's divorce from his first wife, Emily Black, had been finalized only weeks before. For a woman marrying into the most photographed family in American politics, it was a strangely quiet way to become a Kennedy. And Mary would have known exactly how quiet it was, because she had spent more than 20 years watching how Kennedy weddings were supposed to look. She had watched from the inside. That's the detail most coverage of this marriage skips past, and it changes everything about what came later. Mary Richardson didn't meet Bobby Kennedy Jr. at a fundraiser or a gala. She met him when she was a teenager because his sister Carrie was her roommate at the Putney School in Vermont, and the two girls became the kind of friends who essentially merge lives. Mary spent school vacations at Hickory Hill, Ethel Kennedy's sprawling Virginia estate. She was at the family's tables, in the family's photographs, inside the family's rituals, from roughly the age of 15. Several accounts, including Lawrence Lemur's reporting for Newsweek after her death, describe her as carrying a crush on Bobby from those boarding school years, a crush that lasted, in one form or another, for 2 decades before he ever proposed. So when people ask the obvious question, why would a smart, talented woman marry a man weeks out of his first marriage, while pregnant, with warning signs already visible? The honest answer is that Mary wasn't marrying a man she'd just met. She was marrying a family she had half belonged to since childhood. The wedding didn't bring her into the Kennedy world. It formalized a membership she'd been paying dues on since 1974. And she had paid. Mary came from a large Irish Catholic family, one of 7 children, and she lost her father when she was still young. A loss that friends and later biographers consistently identify as a wound that never fully closed. At Putney, according to accounts published after her death, she struggled with anorexia severe enough to alarm the people around her. The pattern that emerges from the surviving record is a young woman of enormous ability. She was gifted, artistic, disciplined, who attached herself early to a family that offered structure, glamour, belonging, and a kind of borrowed permanence. The Kennedys were loud and Catholic and endless. For a fatherless girl from a big family, they were gravity. She built a real life of her own in the meantime, and this matters. Mary became an accomplished designer, working at Parrish Hadley, the legendary New York decorating firm that had done the Kennedy White House rooms, and even her career threaded back into the family mythology. Colleagues described her as genuinely talented, with a serious eye and serious standards. She shared an apartment with Carrie Kennedy in New York as an adult. Her professional world, her social world, and her emotional world all ran through the same family. Keep that in mind. When this marriage eventually went to war, Mary had almost no ground to stand on that the Kennedys didn't own. Bobby, meanwhile, arrived at 1993 as a man in mid-reinvention. His first act had nearly killed him, a heroin addiction that ended in a 1983 arrest after he fell ill on a flight to South Dakota. His court-ordered community service took him to the Hudson River, where he transformed himself into an environmental litigator, the crusading face of Riverkeeper, suing polluters, giving speeches, rebuilding the family franchise, one lawsuit at a time. By the early 90s, he was arguably the most publicly promising of his generation of Kennedys. He was also married to Emily Black, an Indiana lawyer he'd wed in 1982 with 2 young children. That marriage was failing as Bobby and Mary drew together in 1993. What exactly happened in what order is something the participants never fully laid out in public, but the arithmetic of the calendar is not disputed. Mary became pregnant while Bobby was still legally married to Emily. The divorce came through in March 1994. The boat wedding came in April. Their son Connor was born that July. There's one more piece of Catholic machinery here that almost nobody remembers, and it will echo loudly at the end of this story. Bobby pursued an annulment of his first marriage, the church process that declares a marriage essentially void. For a family whose public identity was welded to American Catholicism, the paperwork of erasing an inconvenient union was not a scandal. It was a procedure. Mary, a genuinely devout Catholic, watched her own wedding become possible partly because the church could be persuaded to treat a 12-year marriage with 2 children as something that could be administratively undone. She presumably didn't dwell on what that precedent could one day mean for her. Friends later recalled that people inside the Kennedy orbit privately thought the match was rushed, though those warnings surfaced in retrospect, after everything collapsed, which is exactly when warnings always surface, so weigh them accordingly. What's beyond dispute is the shape of the arrangement Mary walked into. She was the second wife, arriving pregnant, married on a boat with minimal ceremony, to a man whose first family was still absorbing the shock of its own dissolution. She had traded 20 years as the family's beloved insider, Carrie's best friend, everyone's favorite guest, for a formal position with far less protection. A best friend can leave. A wife who has crossed her best friend's brother cannot, not without losing everything at once. For a while, none of that seemed to matter, because the first years produced what the first years of this kind of marriage usually produce: momentum. 4 children in 7 years, Connor in 1994, Kyra in 1995, Finn in 1997, Aiden in 2001. Summers at Hyannisport, that compound where the family operates less like relatives and more like a standing institution, with its rituals, its touch football, its hierarchy of houses, its unspoken rule that the family's collective image outranks any individual member's private complaint. Mary had watched that system as a guest. Now she lived inside it, and the system had a job for her, sir. Her job became the house. The family settled in Bedford, New York, in wealthy Westchester horse country. And over the years, Mary poured her professional identity into transforming the property into something extraordinary. A green-built showcase, engineered around her husband's public brand. This wasn't a hobbyist repainting a kitchen. Mary co-founded the Food Allergy Initiative. Connor had severe allergies and threw her architectural training into sustainable design, working on plans for a home meant to demonstrate that luxury and environmental responsibility could coexist. The project drew admiring press. The couple appeared as a matched set. He fought polluters in court, she built the future in timber and geothermal systems. Riverkeeper galas, magazine features, the whole apparatus of a golden Kennedy branch. Look at what she actually constructed, though. Her career, which had once belonged to her, Parrish Hadley, her own clients, her own name, had been converted into an unpaid extension of her husband's public mission on a property attached to his family, in a marriage witnessed by his relatives, surrounded by friends who were mostly his friends or his sister's friends first. Every hour of her professional talent went into a stage set for the marriage. She had no salary, no independent income of any consequence, no separate territory. The house was the marriage. That's not a metaphor. When the marriage ended, the house is where it ended. And here is where the public story and the private record split apart for the first time, with a piece of evidence that is unusual in stories like this one, because it doesn't come from a bitter friend or a rival's memoir or an anonymous source. It comes from Robert F. Kennedy Jr. himself in his own handwriting. In 2001, Bobby was keeping a meticulous journal. Not an occasional diary, a meticulous one, and in the back of it, according to the New York Post, which obtained and published portions in May 2013, he kept something that reads less like a confession than an accounting system. A running ledger of women, 37 of them in that single year, entered with numeric codes beside their names to categorize what had happened with each one. While America saw the crusader and the architect building their greenhouse, the crusader was keeping books. The journal, as published, is a strange document to sit with. Alongside the coded ledger, Bobby wrote about wrestling with what he called his lust demons, his phrase, not mine, and described his infidelities in the language of addiction and moral struggle. A man cataloging his own sins with the diligence of a bookkeeper who feels terrible about the books, but keeps them anyway. The Post's account came from a leaked source, and Kennedy has never authenticated it, so treat the specifics with appropriate care. But no serious challenge to the document itself ever materialized, and its internal texture, the dates, the codes, the guilt spirals, is not the kind of thing a tabloid invents with that level of tedium. Several of the women, according to the published portions, came from within the couple's own social world. That detail matters more than the number. 37 strangers is a betrayal. A betrayal drawn from your shared circle means your dinner parties, your benefit galas, your weekends are all seated with people who know something you don't. Whether Mary knew in 2001 and how much, the record can't say. What the record does show is what the decade did to her. Friends interviewed by Lawrence Lemur for Newsweek after her death, and sources gathered later by biographers including Jerry Oppenheimer and Maureen Callahan, describe a long deterioration through the 2000s. Deepening depression, drinking that escalated from social to medicinal, cycles of treatment and relapse, a woman increasingly isolated inside a marriage that looked, from the outside, like a partnership. The couple went through marriage counseling, reportedly multiple rounds of it. Nothing held. And here you have to be honest about complexity, because the surviving record does not describe a simple villain and a simple victim. People close to the family described Mary, in her worst periods, as volatile and frightening, accounts that would later be weaponized in ways we'll get to. People close to Mary described a woman being slowly hollowed out by a husband who was chronically absent, chronically unfaithful, and constitutionally incapable of being alone, all while she raised 4 children and managed his showcase home. Both sets of accounts can be true at once. A person can be genuinely ill and genuinely wronged. What's beyond argument is the direction of dependence. Bobby had a public career, an income, a legal team's worth of allies, and the most famous family in America. Mary had the house. The house, in fact, was reaching its final form during exactly these years. Around 2008 and 2009, the Bedford Green Home project drew its warmest press coverage. The geothermal wells, the reclaimed materials, the solar arrays, the whole gleaming demonstration that the Kennedy brand had a sustainable future. Mary gave the tours. Look at that timing. The marriage was in counseling, the drinking was escalating, and the couple's public product was a monument to their shared values, photographed for design press while its architect was coming apart inside it. The rupture, when it came fast and in public. On May 12, 2010, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. filed for divorce. 3 days later, Mary was arrested in Bedford, charged with driving while intoxicated. That August, she was arrested again, this time charged with driving under the influence of drugs, a charge that, for what it's worth, involved prescription medication and was later reduced. 2 arrests in one summer, each one a police report, each police report a headline, each headline another exhibit in a custody war that was now fully underway. I want to slow down on that sequence, because the order of events is the story. Mary didn't spiral and then get served with divorce papers. She was served, and then she spiraled. Or at least, that's when the spiral became public and prosecutable. Friends quoted by Lemur described her as blindsided by the filing, still convinced through much of the process that the marriage could be saved, still referring to Bobby as the love of her life. You can call that devotion, or you can call it the sunk cost of 35 years inside one family's orbit. Either way, she was not negotiating like someone building an exit. She was negotiating like someone trying to get back in. Meanwhile, the practical machinery tightened around her. According to Lemur's Newsweek reporting, sourced to Mary's friends and her family, so weigh it as their account, her credit cards were cut off during the litigation, and the money available to run the household shrank to the point that a woman living in a multi-million-dollar showcase estate was, functionally, broke. She had no career income. She'd given the career to the house. She had no property of her own. The assets were entangled in the marriage. Even her social support ran through the Kennedys, remember? Her best friend since boarding school was her husband's sister. When the marriage went to war, the war was fought entirely on his terrain, with his family, his money, his lawyers, and a shared history in which nearly every witness owed their place at the table to him. Why didn't she just leave, take a settlement, start over? People always ask that, and the record answers it plainly. 4 children were at stake, and Bobby was seeking custody. Her faith made divorce itself a kind of defeat, and she'd already watched the church annul his first marriage, which meant she understood exactly how thoroughly a Kennedy union could be erased once the family decided it should never have existed. And she was ill, publicly and provably ill, with 2 arrests on the record, in a custody fight against a man whose lawyers understood precisely what those arrests were worth. There were moments through 2010 and 2011 when it looked like the temperature might drop. Mary entered treatment. There were stretches of stability, attempts at reconciliation, periods when friends believed the couple might find some sustainable arrangement, if not a marriage, then at least a truce. Her friends later described her as hopeful in these windows, planning for a future, focused on the children. The relief was real enough that people around her believed in it. Then, in September 2011, Bobby's lawyers filed a document in the custody case. It was an affidavit, roughly 60 pages long, sworn by Robert F. Kennedy, Jr., and it was sealed, meaning it was meant for the eyes of the court, not the public. In it, he portrayed his wife as violent, unstable, and dangerous to their children. He described alleged incidents of rage and physical attack. He recounted, in detail, her lowest and most desperate moments across years of psychiatric crisis, the moments a spouse witnesses precisely because they are a spouse, now organized, notarized, and deployed as legal ammunition. Think about what that document was from Mary's side of it. Every breakdown she'd had inside that marriage, every episode her husband had seen because he was the person she was closest to on earth, had been converted into a weapon aimed at the only thing she had left, which was her children. The man kept ledgers. In 2001, the ledger was women. In 2011, the ledger was her. Was any of it true? Some of it may have been. Her own family never claimed Mary was well. What her family disputed, furiously, publicly, later, was the framing. A one-sided sworn narrative, written by an adversary in litigation, presenting a sick woman at her worst moments as the whole of who she was, with none of the context of what the marriage had done to her. An affidavit is not a diagnosis. It's an argument with a notary stamp. But sealed in that court file, it sat like ordnance, waiting. And there was one more pressure building in this same window, though the timeline is genuinely disputed, and I'll flag it as such. Bobby had become involved with the actress Cheryl Hines of Curb Your Enthusiasm. When exactly that relationship began, before Mary's death, or only in its final months, during separation, depends on which account you read, and the parties have kept the details private. What's undisputed is that Mary knew of the relationship in the last period of her life, that the marriage she was still, by her friends' accounts, hoping to repair, had visibly moved on without her. And that the woman who had waited 2 decades to marry Bobby Kennedy was now watching the position get recast while she was still legally in it. By the spring of 2012, Mary's situation had contracted to a single set of walls. She was living in the Bedford house, the green showcase she'd built as the couple's public monument, but living there almost alone. The children were increasingly with their father. The money was throttled. The custody fight was grinding on with that sealed affidavit in the file. Friends who saw her that spring described her as gaunt and frightened, though others recalled stretches when she seemed to be fighting her way back, planning, functioning. Her siblings, the Richardsons, a big, close, loyal family, were mobilized around her, alarmed and increasingly angry at what they saw as a campaign to isolate and break her. She had by then started keeping her own record. Emails to friends, conversations with her family, her own accounting of what the marriage had been, fragments that would surface later when the two families went to war over her memory. It wasn't much of an arsenal against a 60-page sworn affidavit and a family with 60 years of press management behind it. But it existed. Keep it in mind. On the morning of May 16, 2012, a housekeeper found Mary Richardson Kennedy in the barn behind the Bedford house. She was 52 years old. The medical examiner ruled her death a suicide. The toxicology report, made public amid the coverage, found antidepressants in her system and no alcohol, a detail her family would come to cite with bitter precision, because it meant that the woman portrayed in that sealed affidavit as an out-of-control addict died sober on her prescribed medication, alone on the property she had built for a family that was no longer in it. What happened over the next 6 weeks is the reason this story is remembered wrong, and the reason her family and his have never spoken since. The funeral came first, and the funeral was a Kennedy production. It was held at St. Patrick's Church in Bedford, and the family turned out in force. Ethel, the siblings, the cousins, the whole institutional weight of the clan filling the pews for the woman who had spent nearly 40 years among them. Bobby delivered a eulogy. According to those present and to press accounts, he spoke lovingly of Mary, of her gifts and her struggles, told the mourners he'd wondered if he could have done more to save her, and said something that people remembered afterward with different degrees of charity. That he had known this story would end this way, or words to that effect, framing her death as the foregone conclusion of her illness. Grief or narration? It reads differently depending on what you know about the next 2 weeks. Because within days of Mary's death, that sealed 60-page affidavit from the custody case appeared in the press, published through Newsweek and the Daily Beast. The document a court had locked away was suddenly public, in full, with every alleged incident of violence and instability laid out under her husband's oath, at the precise moment Mary could no longer answer a single line of it. Court-sealed filings do not walk into newsrooms on their own. Someone with access made a decision that the public's final picture of Mary Richardson Kennedy should be the picture her legal adversary had drawn of her. No one has ever been formally identified as the source of the leak. Draw your own conclusions about who benefited. The Richardson family drew theirs immediately and said so in public. They denounced the leaked affidavit as a vicious, one-sided assassination of a dead woman's character, their sister recast in the week of her burial as the dangerous madwoman of her husband's court papers. Mary's siblings pushed back with their own account. A sister driven into the ground by years of infidelity and abandonment, financially strangled during the divorce, isolated from her children, and now defamed in death by the same man whose behavior, they argued, had helped destroy her. Two grieving families, two sworn narratives, one press cycle. The Kennedys had been winning press cycles since 1960. There was even a fight over the legal remains of the marriage itself. The Richardsons moved in court, asserting Mary's side of the unfinished divorce. The filings sputtered out because the blunt fact was that death had resolved the custody case in the most absolute way possible. Bobby was the surviving parent. The 4 children were his. Every question the litigation had been built to answer, who was fit, who was dangerous, who would raise these children, was closed by default, and the sealed evidence assembled for that fight was now serving a different purpose entirely, shaping how the world would remember the woman it had been aimed at. Mary was buried at St. Francis Xavier Cemetery in Centerville, Massachusetts, near the Kennedy compound at Hyannisport, placed, in death, inside the family geography she had orbited since she was 15. Her family attended. There was, at least, a grave. Then, a few weeks later, the grave moved. That summer, Mary's body was exhumed and reburied roughly 700 feet away, in a different section of the same cemetery, a newly purchased plot, isolated from other graves, bought on the authority of her husband. The Richardson family said they were not consulted and not informed. They learned their sister had been dug up and relocated after it was done. Cemetery records confirmed the move. The stated logic, as it filtered into press accounts, involved future family burial arrangements. The effect, as the Richardsons experienced it, was that the Kennedys had unilaterally repositioned Mary's body, away from where she'd been laid with her family present, into a lone plot chosen by the man she'd been divorcing, without so much as a phone call to the 7 siblings who had buried her weeks before. Whatever the intent, understand what that act was in the grammar of this story. For 18 years, the marriage had been a system in which Bobby controlled the income, the family, the lawyers, the press relationships, and eventually the sworn narrative of who Mary was. The exhumation extended that control past the boundary where control is supposed to end. Even her location was his decision. Her siblings couldn't contest it, couldn't prevent it, and by their account didn't know about it. The two families never reconciled. By every available account, the Richardsons and the Kennedys, families joined for 4 decades through the closest friendship either had, simply stopped speaking. Permanently. The title of this story is usually read as being about a husband and wife. It's just as true of the 2 families they left behind. Bobby's life resumed its trajectory. In August 2014, 2 years after Mary's death, he married Cheryl Hines in a ceremony at the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport, the full family setting, the 3rd marriage, the church's machinery presumably no obstacle, as it had not been the first time. The following year, 2015, Jerry Oppenheimer published a critical biography of Bobby that revisited the marriage and its end. In 2013, the Post had already put the 2001 journal into the record. The counter-evidence existed. But counter-evidence in a book is a whisper against a 60-page affidavit that ran in a national magazine during a funeral. The first story told is the story that sets. Ask any campaign operative. Ask any Kennedy. For a decade, that's roughly where the record stood. The affidavits Mary in the foreground, the Richardsons Mary in the footnotes. Then the balance shifted, for a reason nobody in 2012 could have predicted. Bobby ran for president. His 2023 and 2024 campaigns dragged every corner of his biography back under the lights. And in 2024, the journalist Maureen Callahan published Ask Not, a book about the women damaged and discarded across generations of Kennedy men, with Mary Richardson Kennedy as one of its central cases. Callahan's account, built on the accumulated record and on sources around Mary, reframe the affidavit not as evidence about Mary, but as evidence about how the family fights. The pattern, stretching back decades, of inconvenient women recast as unstable the moment they became liabilities. You can argue with pieces of Callahan's framing. It's an adversarial book and doesn't pretend otherwise. But its effect was concrete. 12 years after a sealed document defined Mary in death, a best-selling counter-archive existed, and every profile of the candidate now had to reckon with the barn in Bedford. The machinery that had protected the story for a decade was the same machinery that eventually broke it open. Fame. The family name kept the affidavit's version alive, and the family name is what finally drew enough scrutiny to challenge it. And the fragments Mary left, the emails to friends, the accounts she gave her siblings in those last 2 years, the record she started keeping when she realized the marriage was being litigated rather than lived, those fragments became the sourcing. The woman who had no lawyers to match his, no press office, no family foundation, turned out to have done the one thing available to her. She told people. She wrote it down. She made witnesses. It took over a decade for that quiet, outgunned record to find a publisher and a moment, but it did. The affidavit had a 6-week head start and institutional power behind it. Her version had only endurance. As of now, when Mary Richardson Kennedy's name appears in print, it is more likely to appear as the woman the system broke than as the madwoman of the court file. That is not justice. It's something smaller and stranger, a correction, arriving late, carried by the very celebrity that once buried it. The record won't settle everything, and I won't pretend it does. Whether Bobby loved her, in whatever compromised way he was capable of, whether the affidavit's incidents happened as sworn, whether Mary could have been saved by different choices. In 2010 or 1994, the surviving evidence can't close those questions, and the people who could answer them have every reason to answer selectively. What the record establishes is the architecture. A woman gave a family 38 years, a marriage 18, 4 children, and her entire professional life. When the marriage ended, every institution surrounding it, the money, the lawyers, the church that could annul, the press that could be fed, the cemetery plot that could be purchased, answered to one side. She lost the fight while alive. The fight over what she meant is the one still moving. So go back to where America came in. The beautiful greenhouse in Bedford. The magazine spreads, the geothermal wells, the crusader and his architect wife modeling a sustainable future. That house was real. Mary really built it, with real talent, and it really was extraordinary. It was also the most complete piece of evidence she ever created, though not of what the magazines thought. It's the physical record of a woman who converted everything she had, her career, her name, her 20-year devotion, her professional identity, into the stage set of another person's public life, until there was nothing left of her that stood on independent ground. When the performance ended, she was still on the set. She died 100 feet behind it, sober, mid-litigation, 7 weeks before her body was moved to a plot she never chose, by a husband she was divorcing, without a word to the family she came from. The wedding was on his river. The house was for his brand. The affidavit was his sworn story. The funeral was his eulogy. And the grave, twice, was his decision. For 18 years of marriage and 13 years since, one side has held every microphone, which is the plainest way to say what the title says. They never spoke, because only one of them was ever allowed to. Mary Richardson spent her life building rooms for other people. The last one anyone built for her sits 700 feet from where her family said goodbye. And they found out the way the public found out everything about this marriage. After it was already done.